Rachel Monroe stood behind the counter of her saloon in Dustwood, Texas, wiping glasses that would never shine, her calloused hands moving in circles that had become ritual. The year was 1874, and the town simmered under a sun that showed no mercy. At 30 years old, her green eyes carried the weight of widowhood like stones in her pockets, heavy and unrelenting. Her husband James had died in her arms 3 years ago, his blood mixing with the red dust after a Comanche raid, and some said she'd never really buried him. The town respected her grit, but whispered she was cursed, a lone woman running a man's business in a world that had no patience for such defiance. But what they didn't know was that Rachel's grief had hardened into something else entirely, something that would soon ignite a fire in Dustwood that no one could extinguish. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight when the murmurs started outside. Rachel stepped onto the porch, and that's when she saw them. A battered wagon limping into town, groaning under the weight of dreams that had already been crushed a dozen times before. A broad-shouldered man with copper skin sat at the reins, his Comanche features unmistakable despite the settler's clothes he wore. Beside him, a pale woman clutched the wagon's edge, her face carved thin by hardship. 2 children, twins with matching black hair and eyes that had seen too much for 7 years old, peered out from behind their mother's skirts. Rachel's chest tightened. She knew what was coming before the first word was spoken. "Half-breeds," Mrs. Peterson hissed, loud enough for the family to hear. "No room for their kind here." The boarding house matron's lips pressed together like a noose being drawn tight. Reverend Cole turned away, his Bible clutched like a shield against contamination. The wagon stopped, and the man, tall, steady, unmoved by the hatred washing over him like a flood, met the town's collective glare with eyes like granite. His wife sagged under the weight of rejection, and the twins shrank closer to her, confusion and fear written across their small faces. Rachel's pulse quickened. She remembered James's laughter, remembered his blood soaking into her dress, remembered the hate she'd nursed like a poison. But these children, they weren't warriors. They were just tired souls in a merciless land. And in that moment, something cracked open inside Rachel Monroe, something she'd thought died with her husband 3 years ago. 3 miles east, there's a camp for your sort, Mrs. Peterson announced, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Move on. The man remained unmoved, but his wife's shoulders bore the crushing weight of 1,000 rejections before this one. Sheriff Holden leaned against a post, watching with calculated indifference, his badge glinting in the merciless sun. "Careful, Rachel," he drawled as she stepped forward, kicking up dust with her boots. "You'll stir trouble taking in strays like these." Rachel shot him a look sharp enough to draw blood. Kids don't carry their parents' sins, Holden. But inside, her heart wrestled with ghosts that screamed at her to turn away, to let the Comanche blood flow past her door like it had flowed from James's body. She crossed the street anyway, and the crowd parted like grass before wildfire. "I'm Rachel Monroe," she said to the man, her voice firm but not unkind. "Got a room above my saloon. It's yours till you find your footing." The man's eyes searched hers, deep and probing. Why help us when they won't? His voice was rough as stone scraped against stone. Rachel met his gaze unflinching, though inside she was trembling. "I know what it's like to be judged for what you ain't chosen. Widow running a saloon ain't exactly proper in Dustwood's eyes either." A flicker of understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared exile. "I'm Jonah Black Elk," he said finally. "This is Hannah, my wife, and our twins, Lily and James." The girl's name hit Rachel like a fist. James, named for a husband she'd never buried properly in her heart. The crowd muttered their disapproval, a low growl that promised consequences. Mrs. Peterson crossed her arms, her face twisted with contempt. "You'll regret this, Rachel." Sheriff Holden tipped his hat, his smile thin as paper. "Your funeral, ma'am." But Rachel led them inside anyway, the floorboards creaking a welcome that Dustwood refused to offer. That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel sat by a flickering lamp while the family's presence filled the space above with sounds she hadn't heard in years. Footsteps, quiet voices, life. The saloon had been a tomb for 3 years. and now it breathed again. But outside, Dustwood's whispers grew darker, coiling like snakes in the dust. Rachel knew her choice had set her against the town's tide, but what she didn't know was that the real test hadn't even begun. What would it cost her to shelter strangers in a place where fear and prejudice ran deeper than the earth itself? And could she survive what was coming when the town decided to make an example of her? By dawn, the red dust swirled outside Rachel's windows, carrying whispers sharp as barbed wire. She stood at the counter polishing glasses, her mind heavy with the gamble she'd taken. The creaking floorboards above reminded her of the family, strangers who'd sparked something in her solitary existence she couldn't name. The saloon doors swung open, and Martha, her young barmaid with freckles scattered like buckshot across her nose, hurried in. "Folks are talking, Miss Rachel," Martha said, her voice low, eyes darting to the street. "Say you're courting trouble with them half-breeds." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept stacking glasses with steady hands. "Let them talk, Martha. Tongues don't draw blood." But even as she said it, she knew words could cut deeper than any blade, and Dustwood's tongues were sharpening themselves for war. By mid-morning, the street buzzed with the day's rhythm, hooves clattering, wagon wheels grinding, when a sudden shout sliced through the noise like a knife through flesh. Rachel dropped her rag and rushed to the porch. Across the street near the livery, a knot of boys circled like coyotes around prey. At the center stood Lily and James, hunched together, small bodies braced for impact. Billy Thompson, the mayor's son with a bully's gleeful grin, hefted a rock in his fist. "Go back to your savage camp," he jeered, hurling it. The stone grazed James's shoulder, drawing a sharp yelp that Rachel felt in her bones. Her blood surged, boots hitting the dirt before thought could catch up. "Get back!" she roared, shoving through the crowd of onlookers, shopkeepers, loafers, women with baskets who stood frozen, some smirking, others shifting uneasily but doing nothing. Another rock flew, catching Rachel's forearm with a sting she ignored. She planted herself between the twins and the boys, her shadow falling over Lily and James like a shield. But what happened next would change everything. "Enough, Billy Thompson!" Her voice cracked like a whip, but Billy's grin only widened with the confidence of a boy who knew his father ran the town. "Protecting Indians now, Miss Monroe? My pa says they're trouble." The crowd murmured agreement, a low growl of collective hatred that made Rachel's stomach turn. Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife, sniffed and twirled her parasol. "Let the young'uns sort it out. Teaches them their place." Before Rachel could retort, Lily's small voice piped up, trembling but defiant. "We ain't hurting nobody." The crowd stilled, her words hanging in the dust-choked air like a judgment. James, clutching his sister's hand, glared at Billy with brown eyes fierce despite his fear. Then Sheriff Holden's shadow loomed as he pushed through, spurs jingling. "What's this ruckus?" he drawled, hand resting on his revolver. The boys scattered like roaches, Billy tossing one last stone that skittered harmlessly into the dirt. Rachel's arm throbbed, blood staining her sleeve, but she stood tall with the twins behind her. "Just kids throwing rocks at kids, Sheriff," she said, her tone edged with steel. "Seems Dustwood's got a lesson to learn about decency." Holden's eyes flicked to the twins, then back to Rachel with a warning that hung heavy. "You're stirring a hornet's nest, Rachel. Folks don't take kindly to this." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing there with two frightened children and a town that wanted her to fail. That evening, lantern light cast long shadows as Rachel sat with Jonah and Hannah at a corner table, while the twins slept upstairs, exhausted from cruelty they shouldn't have to understand. Jonah's face was a mask of controlled anger, hands clenched around a tin mug. "I should have been there," he said, voice low and rough as gravel. "This town's no different from the rest." Hannah's hand rested on his, her eyes weary but warm. "You couldn't know, Jonah." She turned to Rachel, gratitude softening her words. "But Miss Rachel, you stood for them when no one else would." Rachel shifted, uncomfortable with praise she didn't feel she'd earned. "Did what was right, that's all." But Jonah leaned forward, his gaze piercing through the dim light. "Right ain't common in places like this. My mother, a white woman, learned that when her own turned on her for loving my father. He was Comanche. They strung him up for it." His words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward into Rachel's consciousness. She saw then that her hate hadn't been for Jonah's blood, but for the blindness of those who judged him. Hannah offered a small pouch of dried sage. "For your arm, it'll ease the sting." Rachel took it, the scent grounding her in the moment. But what Jonah said next would change the course of everything. "Dustwood's just another stop," Jonah continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "But those kids, they're starting to feel the hate seep into their bones. It's changing them." Rachel's chest ached, the twins' faces flashing in her mind, their confusion, their fear, their small defiant voices. "They don't deserve it," she said quietly. "No one does." The saloon fell silent except for the night pressing against the windows, thick with stars and secrets. Rachel felt a shift, a crack in the walls she'd built around her heart after James died. Protecting the twins had ignited something, a purpose beyond mere survival. But Dustwood's prejudice was a coiled snake, and she knew today's stones were only the beginning. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would test her in ways she couldn't imagine, and that the cliffs south of town held a fate that would either break her or forge her into something stronger than grief. The twins' frightened eyes and Jonah's heavy words lingered in Rachel's mind, kindling a fire to shield this family from a town that drew lines in the dust and defended them with violence. By the third day, the red earth baked under a sun offering no mercy. Rachel watched Lily and James through the saloon's window, their small forms darting in the fenced yard behind, chasing shadows with wooden toys Jonah had carved. Their laughter was a rare sound, fragile as glass in this hard-bitten town. "They need more than a yard to run in," Rachel muttered to herself, hands busy sweeping the porch. The twins deserved a taste of freedom, a moment to be children instead of outcasts bearing the weight of their parents' bloodlines. She turned to Hannah, who was mending a torn shirt in the shade. "There's a spot south of town by the cliffs. Quiet, open, no folks to bother us. Let's take them there tomorrow." Hannah's eyes flickered with worry, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Jonah won't like it. Too exposed." Rachel leaned on her broom, her gaze steady as iron. "He can come along. I'll close the saloon for an afternoon. Martha can handle the regulars." Hannah hesitated, then nodded, a faint hope softening her worn face. What none of them knew was that this decision would lead to a moment that would either destroy them all or save them in ways they couldn't foresee. By evening, Jonah agreed with reluctance clear in every line of his body, swayed by the twins' eager pleas. "Stay close," he warned, voice like iron striking iron. "No wandering." The next morning, they set out under a sky wide and blue as a promise that had never been broken. Rachel carried a basket of cornbread, smoked meat, and a jar of sarsaparilla, boots crunching on the rocky path winding past Dustwood's edge. Jonah walked ahead, eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk searching for prey, his broad frame a barrier between his family and whatever unseen threats lurked beyond. The twins skipped beside Hannah, their chatter a bright thread in the silence of the hills. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and ancient, overlooking a valley where the plains stretched endless and wild, like an ocean frozen in earth and grass. They spread a blanket on a flat plateau, the cliff's edge a safe distance away, the view stealing Rachel's breath, a sea of gold and green under a sky close enough to touch. Lily and James laughed, tossing pebbles into a shallow gully, their joy cutting through the weight Rachel carried like a knife through rope. She caught Jonah's eye, saw a rare softness in his guarded stare. "This is good," he said, almost to himself. "They need this." Rachel smiled, unpacking the basket. The meal was simple but warm, the twins' giggles mingling with the rustle of wind through scrub brush. Jonah relaxed, leaning back, his hand brushing Hannah's in a gesture of connection that spoke volumes. But peace in Dustwood's shadow was as fleeting as desert rain, and what came next would test them all beyond measure. A low rumble broke the calm, the ground trembling beneath their feet like something ancient waking. Rachel froze, eyes darting to the twins who'd wandered closer to the cliff's edge, chasing a lizard across the rocks. "Lily! James!" Jonah shouted, already moving, boots pounding earth. The cliff's edge, softened by recent rains neither had thought about, gave way in a sickening crumble that sounded like bones breaking. Lily screamed as the ground slid beneath her, small hands scrabbling at loose dirt that offered no purchase. James lunged for her, only to slip himself, both tumbling toward a sheer drop that promised nothing but death. Jonah dove with a father's desperate speed, fingers closing around James's wrist, yanking him back from the brink with strength born of terror. But Lily slid further, her body caught on a jutting rock, legs dangling over 100-foot void, her cries piercing the air sharp as a blade through flesh. A handful of townspeople, drawn by curiosity, had followed at a distance like vultures waiting for carrion, and now stood on a nearby rise, their faces a mix of shock and something darker, malice disguised as helplessness. "Let her go," one muttered, his voice carrying on the wind like poison. Others shuffled, eyes averted, fear and prejudice rooting them in place more firmly than any tree. And in that moment, Rachel knew she was the only one who would act. Rachel's heart thundered, boots kicking off as she ran to the edge with no thought for her own safety. "Hold on, Lily!" she called, voice steady despite panic clawing at her chest like wild animals. She dropped to her knees, peering over the edge where a narrow ledge, barely a foot wide, snaked below toward Lily's trembling form. "Rachel! No!" Hannah gasped, but Rachel was already lowering herself, hands gripping sharp stone, blood welling from cuts that painted the rock red. The ledge crumbled under her weight, pebbles raining into the abyss below, each one a reminder of how easily she could follow. She pressed against the cliff face, inching sideways, breath ragged, vision narrowing to just Lily's frightened face. "Look at me, Lily," she urged, locking eyes with the girl whose name echoed her dead husband's. "I'm coming." The townspeople watched in silence, their inaction louder than words, a judgment more damning than any spoken condemnation. Lily's fingers slipped, the rock she clung to shifting with a sound that stopped Rachel's heart. "Jump!" Rachel shouted, arms outstretched, knowing this was madness, knowing she had no choice. With a desperate cry that seemed to tear the sky, Lily launched herself into empty air, and Rachel caught her, the impact nearly sending them both into the void where only death waited. Jonah's leather belt snaked down, his voice taut as a wire about to snap. "Grab it!" Rachel looped it around her wrist, holding Lily tight against her chest as Jonah and Hannah pulled with strength, fueled by fear and love and desperation. The cliff groaned like a living thing in pain, but they hauled Rachel and Lily up inch by agonizing inch, collapsing in a heap on solid ground that felt like salvation. Lily sobbed into Rachel's chest, her small body shaking with aftershocks of terror. The townspeople dispersed then, some muttering, others silent, their faces haunted by what they hadn't done, by the cowardice they'd witnessed in themselves. Rachel's hands bled, breath uneven, but she held Lily close, knowing Dustwood's cliffs had carved a new line in her story, one that would echo far beyond this day. But what Rachel didn't know was that this moment had been witnessed by someone who would change everything, someone whose power in Dustwood reached further than any sheriff's badge or mayor's decree, and tomorrow that power would reveal itself in ways Rachel couldn't predict. By morning, Dustwood buzzed with tales of the near tragedy, the air thick with whispers carrying both awe and venom, like dual poisons mixing in the town's collective throat. Rachel opened her saloon, hands bandaged but steady, cuts from the cliff stinging with every movement. The usual crowd was sparse, replaced by curious faces, some drawn by gossip, others by grudging respect they couldn't quite hide. Mrs. Peterson, the boarding-house matron, lingered at the counter, eyes flicking to Rachel's bandages with something that might have been admiration fighting against her nature. "Heard you climb down that cliff like a mountain goat," she said, tone half admiring, half accusing, as if bravery itself was suspect. Rachel poured a shot of whiskey, gaze cool as winter water. "Did what needed doing. No more, no less." Mrs. Peterson huffed but bought a bottle, her silence louder than her usual barbs, a shift so subtle Rachel almost missed it. By noon, the saloon's air was heavy with tension, the townspeople's stares a mix of judgment and unease, as if Rachel had upset some natural order they'd relied upon. Word of her deed had spread like wildfire across the plains, twisting with each retelling into legend and accusation in equal measure. Some called her reckless, a fool for risking her neck for a half-breed child who wasn't her responsibility. Others, quieter, spoke of her grit in voices low, as if afraid to be heard speaking praise for what decency demanded. Martha, wiping tables, caught Rachel's eye. "They're talking different now, Miss Rachel. Not all, but some." Rachel nodded, lips tight. "Some's a start." But she knew this was far from over. Sheriff Holden strode in, spurs clinking, face unreadable as a blank page. "Town's in a stir, Rachel," he said, leaning on the counter with calculated casualness. "Mayor Thompson wants you and the Black Elks at his office before noon." Rachel's gut tightened, sensing a trap being laid with careful precision. "What's he want?" she asked, voice sharp as a spur. Holden shrugged, eyes weary with knowledge he wouldn't share. "Reckon it's about that deadline he set for them to leave. But after yesterday, might be more." He tipped his hat and left, leaving a cloud of dust and doubt hanging in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't quite fired yet. Rachel found Jonah and Hannah upstairs, the twins clinging to their parents, still shaken from the Cliff's betrayal. "Thompson wants a word," she said, tone steady but laced with caution earned through experience. Jonah's jaw clenched, dark eyes narrowing to slits. "They want us gone. Nothing new." Hannah touched his arm, voice soft but insistent. "Let's hear them out. Miss Rachel's earned us that much." The twins, wide-eyed and trusting, nodded, their faith in Rachel a weight she felt in her bones like a responsibility she never asked for but couldn't refuse. What awaited them at the mayor's office would either destroy the fragile peace Rachel had fought for or transform it into something stronger. But which one? None of them could guess. The mayor's office, a squat building of weathered wood, loomed at Dustwood's heart like a judgment waiting to be passed. Inside, Mayor Thompson sat behind a desk, mustache twitching, flanked by council members whose faces ranged from stern to sheepish, as if they already regretted what they'd come to do. But it was the man in the corner who commanded the room's attention. Colonel Hawthorne, the ranch owner whose name carried weight like a loaded rifle, his presence commanding silence more effectively than any gavel. "Miss Monroe, Mr. and Mrs. Black Elk," Thompson began, voice oily as snake scales. "We're here to discuss recent events." Rachel sat, back straight, the twins beside her, their small hands gripping hers with trust she prayed she could honor. Jonah stood, stance unyielding as stone, Hannah at his side. Thompson cleared his throat, uneasy under Jonah's gaze that seemed to see through walls and lies alike. "Your actions, Miss Monroe, were remarkable. Saved a child's life." Rachel's eyes narrowed, waiting for the blade she knew was coming. "But?" she prompted, voice steady. Thompson shifted, suddenly looking smaller. "No but. The council's reconsidered. The order for the Black Elks to leave. It's rescinded, provided they follow town laws." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward into silence so profound it hurt. Jonah's voice cut through, low and steady as bedrock. "Why the change, Mayor? My blood ain't different since yesterday." The room stilled, councilmen avoiding Jonah's gaze like children caught stealing, their shame palpable as sweat in summer heat. Colonel Hawthorne stepped forward then, boots heavy on the floorboards, each step announcing his authority. "I requested this meeting," he said, voice like gravel rolling downhill. "Mr. Black Elk, I hear you're a hand with horses, know the land better than most settlers who've been here twice as long. My ranch needs a man like you. Manage my stock, patrol the boundaries. Comes with a house, schooling for your kids." The offer hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud about to break. Impossible to believe, too good to trust. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. A job like that was rare as rain in August, especially for a man of Jonah's heritage who most ranchers wouldn't hire to shovel manure. Hannah's eyes shone with hope so bright it hurt to look at, but Jonah remained wary, years of betrayal making him cautious as a wolf in a trap. "Why me?" he asked, tone edged with suspicion earned through hard experience. Hawthorne met his gaze unflinching, and what he said next would crack open something in Dustwood that had been sealed shut for generations. "Lost a brother to men who judged his blood, not his worth," Hawthorne said, each word deliberate as a hammer strike. "I don't make that mistake. And Miss Monroe's courage yesterday shamed half this town into seeing clear for the first time in their miserable lives." The councilmen squirmed, their silence admitting guilt louder than any confession. Thompson coughed, eager to move past his own cowardice. "The town will fix your saloon's roof, Miss Monroe. A token of gratitude." Rachel raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by the gesture that felt like paying for a life with a handful of nails, but her focus was on Jonah, who seemed to be weighing this offer against every betrayal he'd ever endured. He nodded slowly, carefully, like a man stepping onto ice that might crack. "I'll see your ranch, Colonel, then decide." Hawthorne tipped his hat, respect evident in the gesture. "Tomorrow, bring your family." Outside, under the blazing sun that had witnessed everything, Hannah's voice trembled with hope she was afraid to feel fully. "A home, Jonah. School for the kids." Jonah's gaze softened, but caution lingered like smoke after fire. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." Rachel watched them, her heart torn between joy at their chance and a strange ache at their coming departure, as if saving them meant losing them, a cost she hadn't anticipated paying. Lily tugged Rachel's sleeve, her small face upturned with absolute faith. "You'll visit us, right, Miss Rachel?" Rachel knelt, her smile genuine despite the tightness in her chest. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away, darling." As they walked back to the saloon, Dustwood's whispers felt different. Less venom, more questions, as if the town itself was uncertain which direction to turn. Rachel knew the town wasn't changed, not truly, not yet. But a crack had formed in its armor, and she'd helped pry it open with her bare, bleeding hands. The Black Elks had a chance now, and she'd fight to keep it that way, whatever the cost. But what Rachel didn't realize was that her fight was just beginning, and that the real transformation, both of Dustwood and herself, would demand a sacrifice she never saw coming. Dawn broke over Dustwood the next morning, red dust swirling like a restless spirit as Rachel swept her saloon's porch, bandaged hands still tender but working nonetheless. Jonah and his family ready to visit Hawthorne's ranch, their few belongings packed into the wagon that had carried them through rejection after rejection, each town's cruelty adding another layer to their armor. Rachel watched from the saloon's doorway, chest tight with a mix of hope and loss she couldn't untangle. Lily and James darted about, their excitement a stark contrast to the town's heavy air that pressed down like judgment waiting to be passed. "We're going to see horses, Miss Rachel," James called, his grin wide as the plains themselves. Rachel forced a smile, heart catching at the thought of their absence leaving a hole in the life she'd rebuilt. "Reckon you'll ride one before long," she replied, voice steady despite the ache blooming in her chest like a flower made of thorns. By midday, the family returned, their faces transformed in ways that took Rachel's breath away. Hannah's eyes sparkled with a light Rachel hadn't seen before, as if hope had finally found a home in her weary soul. "The ranch, it's more than we dreamed," she said, hands clutching a folded cloth as if it held every prayer she'd ever whispered. A cabin by a stream, 3 rooms, sturdy as stone, windows that let in light instead of keeping it out. Jonah nodded, his usual caution softened like ice beginning to thaw. "Hawthorne's daughter, Elizabeth, runs the school. She's got books on Comanche ways, wants the kids to share them, to teach the others." Rachel's throat tightened at the image, Lily and James not hiding their heritage but celebrating it, not bearing it as a mark of shame but wearing it as a badge of pride. "Sounds right," she said, words simple but heavy with meaning she couldn't quite articulate. The saloon buzzed with curious townspeople, their whispers now tinged with something new, respect, however reluctant, however grudging, however small. Mr. Cooper, the livery owner, clapped Jonah's shoulder with genuine warmth. "Heard you're a wizard with horses, Black Elk. Hawthorne's lucky to have you." Even Mrs. Peterson, face still pinched with disapproval she couldn't quite release, offered a basket of cornbread, muttering, "For the road," as if the words cost her something valuable. Rachel caught the shift, subtle but real, like a river carving a new path through stone 1 grain at a time. As the family loaded their wagon, Dustwood gathered, not with pitchforks and torches, but with quiet gestures that spoke louder than violence ever could. Billy Thompson, the mayor's son who'd thrown stones just days ago, shuffled forward, head low with shame he was learning to feel. He offered Lily and James a pair of carved wooden horses, his face red as the dust beneath their feet. "Sorry about the rocks," he mumbled. The apology dragged from him, but sincere nonetheless. Lily took hers, smile shy but forgiving in the way only children can forgive, their hearts not yet hardened by the world's cruelties. Rachel watched, her heart stirring with something she'd thought died with James. Hope that people could change, that redemption wasn't just a word preachers threw around on Sundays. Colonel Hawthorne rode up then, his presence commanding the street like a general surveying his troops. "Ready, Black Elk?" he called, voice warm but firm, the tone of a man used to being obeyed but earning that obedience through respect. Jonah nodded, then turned to Rachel, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stepped close, hand extended, rough and calloused from work that never ended. "My people say a brave heart sees clear when others are blind," he said, voice low and steady as bedrock beneath their feet. "You're that heart, Rachel Monroe." He clasped her hand, a gesture that crossed worlds and generations, binding them in a way words couldn't capture, a connection forged in crisis and sealed in courage. Hannah embraced her next, grip fierce as a mother protecting her young. "You gave us a chance when no one else would. You gave us hope when we'd forgotten what it felt like." Lily and James flung themselves at Rachel, small arms wrapping around her legs with the absolute trust of children who've found safety in a dangerous world. "You'll come see us, Miss Rachel?" Lily asked, eyes wide with need. "Promise," James added, clutching his wooden horse like a talisman against future hurts. Rachel knelt, voice soft but sure as stone. "I'll be there, come hell or high water." Their laughter, bright and unburdened, filled the air like bells ringing in a town that had forgotten what celebrations sounded like. The wagon rolled out, dust trailing like a fading dream, like hope made visible in the morning light. Rachel stood alone, the saloon's shadow long across the street, watching them disappear into distance and possibility. Sheriff Holden appeared beside her then, spurs quiet for once, as if he too felt the weight of the moment. "You've turned this town upside down, Rachel," he said, tone almost gentle, almost human. "Folks are talking different about you, about them, about what's right." Rachel's gaze followed the wagon's path until it vanished into the shimmer of heat and distance. "One family at a time, Sheriff. That's how it starts. That's how everything changes." But what Rachel didn't know was that her own transformation was far from complete, that the story she'd started writing with her courage on the cliff would demand one more chapter, one more sacrifice, one more leap into the unknown that would either complete her redemption or destroy her entirely. Weeks later, Rachel stood on a new porch, not at her saloon, but at a cabin on Hawthorne's ranch, the building still smelling of fresh wood and new beginnings. She'd taken the teaching job Elizabeth offered after 3 sleepless nights of wrestling with the decision, her saloon left in Martha's capable hands with a trust she'd never extended to another living soul. The plains stretched before her now, alive with the shouts of children racing to the schoolhouse like it was the most important place in the world. Lily and James were among them, their laughter carrying on the wind like music Rachel had forgotten existed. Jonah worked in the distance, his skill with horses earning nods from ranch hands who'd once spat at his name, men learning that worth had nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with character. Hannah approached with a basket of eggs in hand, morning light catching in her hair. "Regrets?" she asked, eyes searching Rachel's face for signs of second-guessing. Rachel shook her head, the horizon sharp and clear in ways it hadn't been since James died, since grief had clouded her vision and narrowed her world to just survival. "None. I thought saving Lily was about her, but it was me too. I found my place, Hannah. I found the life I was supposed to be living all along." The women walked toward the schoolhouse where Elizabeth waited, her smile welcoming in a way Dustwood's faces never had been. Dustwood's dust still clung to Rachel's boots, a reminder of where she'd come from, of the woman she'd been when grief was her only companion. But here, among new beginnings and second chances, She stood taller than she had in 3 years. The Black Elks had found a home, and Rachel had found a purpose carved not in stone or written in blood, but built in the hearts of a family she'd chosen to save, and a town learning, slowly, painfully, to see beyond the red dust and old hatreds that had defined it for too long. The schoolhouse door opened, and children poured out for recess, their voices a chorus of possibility. Lily ran to Rachel, grabbing her hand. "Miss Rachel, I told them about my father's people today, about the stars and the stories, and they listened." Rachel squeezed her hand, throat tight with emotion she'd been holding back for weeks. "That's how it starts, Lily. One story at a time, one heart at a time." She looked up at the endless Texas sky, thinking of James, of the man he'd been and the man he'd never become, of the hate she'd carried and finally released. "I'm free," she whispered to the wind that carried her words away. "Finally, I'm free." The dust of Dustwood has settled now, but Rachel's courage and the Black Elk's resilience linger in that town like seeds planted in hard ground, waiting to bloom. What moved you most in their story? Was it Rachel's defiance when everyone expected her to fail? The twins' innocence that shamed a town into seeing its own cruelty? Or the slow awakening of people who'd lived in darkness so long they'd forgotten what light looked like? The truth is, courage isn't one grand gesture. It's 1,000 small choices to do what's right when it would be easier to look away. It's a widow extending a hand to strangers when her own grief tells her to close her door. It's a man standing firm when the world wants him to disappear. It's children forgiving when they have every right to hate. It's a town learning, slowly, painfully, that the lines they've drawn in the dust are nothing but dust themselves, ready to blow away in the first strong wind. If this story moved you, if Rachel's journey from grief to redemption struck something in your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Your voice keeps these stories alive, keeps these lessons burning bright in a world that still draws too many lines, still carries too much hate, still needs too many people willing to climb down cliffs for children who aren't their own. I'm grateful for every moment you've spent with this tale, riding through the grit and heart of 1874 Texas, where one woman's courage cracked open a town's conscience. Drop a comment. Tell me what part grabbed you hardest, and let's keep the fire of these stories burning until everyone learns what Rachel learned, that saving someone else might be the only way to save yourself. Until we meet again on the next trail, stay bold, stay brave, and keep seeing clearly past the dust and prejudice to the humanity underneath. Subscribe now, because these stories don't just entertain, they remind us who we can become when courage calls and we choose to answer.